Welcome to Flower Power, how plants get what they want from pollinators. And we're thrilled to have Robin Hopkins as our featured guest speaker for this afternoon. Robin received her bachelor's in biology from Brown University in 2003 and a PhD in biology from Duke University in 2010. She has recently been named the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Natural Sciences within the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. In 2014, Robin started the Hopkins Lab at the Weld Hill Research Facility at the Arnold Arboretum. The lab's research focuses on the evolutionary processes involved in speciation and adaptation in plants. This includes investigating plant-pollinator relationships and floral traits as drivers of speciation and flower morphology. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I wish so much that we could be walking around the Arboretum and looking at flowers in person, and I hope that at least some of you get out there to do that later this week. But if we have to be staring at our computer, I am glad that we are staring at flowers. So Anna Maria, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for joining us. I'm gonna start with a little inspiration. Let's see. All right, so there is an incredible diversity of flowers. I think probably everyone who is logged in now has at one point or another sat back and just been in awe of the colors and shapes and smells and textures of flowers. So I will say that I was first inspired by the beauty and diversity of flowers in my mom's garden. So this is a picture of my mom's garden, just a small corner of it that I grew up playing in as a kid, helping her weed and deadhead and smelling and touching every flower that bloomed. And it was here that I was first in awe of flowers. And to me, it was just diversity that existed for the garden. And it wasn't until I became a biologist and through high school and into college and even graduate school that I really started to wonder, why does all this diversity occur? It can't possibly be just for gardeners. We are not the center of the universe. So that got me thinking that this diversity must exist for some other reason. Maybe it's obvious to you all, but most of it probably exists for pollinators. So it's estimated that on average, about 90% of all flowering plants depend on pollinators to move pollen between flowers to set seed. So that means for most of these plants, the sole purpose of that beautiful, diverse flower form is to convince these pollinators to come and visit. So then we should sit back and think, what is it that plants want specifically from these pollinators that drives them to evolve these crazy colors and shapes and smells and textures? And what is it that pollinators want from flowers that just keep them coming back over and over again and make them reliable visitors to these flowers? So a plant, what does a plant want? Well, a plant wants to reproduce. So the flower will attract pollinators to bring pollen. That pollen is used to as a carrier for sperm that combines with an egg that will eventually make a seed. And this seed is then the next generation of plant. So for most plants, in order to set a seed, they need a pollinator to come and bring pollen. But what does a pollinator want? Most of the time, it's food. So flowers are often sticky, and if you stick them on your tongue, make sure you know which flower it is first, they're sweet. So this is nectar. Many, many pollinators come to these flowers to drink nectar. Super concentrated, sugary water that gives them bursts of energy to keep flying, reproducing, and carrying on with their lives. They also sometimes come to eat the pollen. Pollen are these incredibly dense packets of protein that are wonderful bee larvae food. So the bees collect it and bring it to their babies. And even there's a butterfly that collects it and eats it as well. So most of the time, plants are offering flower parts, nectar, pollen, as food to entice pollinators to come and visit. So that's briefly why we have all this diversity of plants. But before we go into too many details, let's look closely at a flower and think about what all these parts are. By naming these parts of the flower and thinking a little bit about their function, we can probably better understand where some of this diversity comes from. So we'll start with some of the very basics. A flower is made up of what we call whorls. These are rings of organs that together make up the flower. The outermost whorl, here in this lily flower, it looks pink, but it's often green. This is a sepal. Inner side of that is a whorl of petals. These petals are usually that showy, bright structure that attracts us and usually pollinators to the flower. Inside that whorl are the male reproductive organs. These are the stamens right here. And they're made up usually on the top of an anther. And inside that anther is the pollen. And probably some of you gardeners out there know that if you were to pick this lily flower, that pollen is bright red or orange and will stain anything that touches it. So we do actually find quite interesting diversity in pollen and anther shapes and colors. This pollen contains, like I said, the sperm, and it's important for this pollen to be carried to other flowers in order for seeds to set. The very center whorl on flowers is the female reproductive organ. This is the pistil. And at the tip of the pistil is usually this blobby, sticky part called the stigma. This stigma is what captures that pollen. It sticks to it and then takes the sperm through down the pollen tube, down into the ovules where it will set a seed and grow into the next generation of plant. So those are the visible reproductive parts of the flower. But when we think about diversity, we should also think about nectar, which often sits way down at the bottom of where the petals come together. And then obviously scent, which we can notice as we walk by many of these plants. So let's take a minute. This is a lily. I like looking at a lily flower because the parts are big and obvious, but let's take a minute and head on over to look at some flowers. So here we have some flowers that I just picked from my garden, and we'll see if we can find all of these pieces of parts of the flower that we were talking about. So this is a pansy. On the back side, the first whorl, you'll see these green parts here. These are the sepals. They hold the petals in place, sometimes act as tough structured organs. In here we have the showy petals here. And if we pull back these petals, we'll see the male and female reproductive parts. The male reproductive parts are tucked in here. Most of the pollen, this is an old flower, and most of the pollen's already gone, but they're all in this little whorl right there. And this, right in the center, is the female reproductive part. That's the sticky stigma up top. And then down here, this, the ovary, that's where the seed will set and turn into a seed. So that's a pansy. How about this Weigela? This I collected at the Arboretum yesterday. You shouldn't do that, but I got to, just for this event. Again, we see these subtle green sepals, these beautiful petals. In this case, they're all attached. There are 5 of them, but they're all nicely attached to each other. And if we rip open this, you can see 5 of the male anthers. These are pretty awesome, I think. They have these little hinges. here, that when the pollinators rub up against him, they'll wiggle and move. And then this, my favorite part of this flower, the pistil is topped by this gigantic stigma. Again, this is what collects the pollen to set the seed. Here's a geranium, oops, from my garden. The part I want to show you here, here's the sepals and the petals. But look at these anthers. I'm sure not everybody's camera is as clear as mine, but I hope you can see these crazy purple anthers where the pollen is in. So diversity is not just in the petals, it's also in the anthers. And then in the middle, the stigmas are here. All right, now the fun one. Here's a little daisy. If we start on the outer edge, we see these petals. But what's really neat about this daisy is that these are just actually petals from sterile little flowers. And if we rip this open, you all should do this at home. Every single one of these is a flower. And if you dig down deep into them with a little hand lens, you'll see that each one of these contains petals and male reproductive parts with anthers and female reproductive parts with stigmas. And they're all together in what's called a composite flower, where these are what's called ray flowers with the showy petals, and these are what are called disc flowers with little teeny reproductive parts. The pollinators will come here to collect the pollen off the top, usually bees, sometimes suck a little nectar if they're made, usually not much. And then they set seed. So there's just a touch of some of the plant diversity. Okay, so we just tore apart a couple flowers, we looked at some lily flowers, and now we might ask ourselves, there's a lot of diversity. Clearly we're there for pollinators, but why so variable? Why is there not just one flower color, shape, size that will be the best that every flower seeks to be? So to answer that question, I will ask you, what is your favorite color? For some people it might be green, for some people it might be blue. For me, it's obviously pink. It always has been, it always will be. What about your favorite dessert? For some people, it's probably chocolate ice cream. For others, it's strawberry shortcake. For others, all they want is a popsicle. So my point here is that different people have different things they like, and so do different pollinators. So bees like one color, birds like another color, butterflies like another color. Little pollinators want a certain shaped flower. Big pollinators want a different shaped flower. Some pollinators like really sweet nectar, and some pollinators like less sweet nectar, but a lot of it. Some pollinators need pollen that's packed, already bundled and ready to go, and some pollinators want their pollen to be loose and fluffy so it's easy to package themselves up to go. And so the diversity that we see in these flowering plants is really, in many cases, a diversity in what the pollinators want. So pollinators can be picky, kind of like children in what they want. And plants, like parents, try to cater to their every desire. Clearly, I've been home with my children too long, if that's the analogy I'm going to use, but in many ways it works, right? So plants want to convince the pollinators to come and take their pollen or give them pollen that works. And in so doing, they give them rewards. Eat your broccoli and you can have ice cream for dessert. Come take my pollen and you get the nectar. This is essentially what the plants are doing, except sometimes they're more manipulative than that. Sometimes they're more like, here, try this smoothie. Little do you know, I put kale in it. right? So the plants will trick the pollinators to coming to drink the nectar and then place the pollen in just the right spot so the pollinator doesn't know and carries it off to the next plant. So these are some of the sort of sneaky, tricky ideas that plants have evolved to successfully get their pollen moved to different plants. So let's take a peek now at what some of these flowers look like and how we can look at the diversity of flowers and learn something about what pollinators want and why the plants have evolved to be that way. All right, so let's start with bees. Turns out bees are one of the most important pollinators. Most people probably know this, but they make up a huge proportion of the insect pollination that exists. And bees tend to like a few different types of flowers. One type of flower is this sort of purple blue tubular shaped flower with big wide open mouths and often a very large bottom lip petal. This is what we often call a landing pad. So we can see here on this violet, this big bottom lip. Here on this mint plant, there's a big bottom lip. These plants are often sweet smelling, attracting the bees. They hold a fair amount of good nectar, medium concentration. And they often have these patterns that look, well, we call them like runway guides, right? So they're these nectar guides that show the bee pollinator where to go for nectar. So they're white or dark patterned stripes that go into the center of the flower that will guide the bee in to show them this is where your pollen and this is where your nectar is. The other type of flower that bees often are attracted to are round yellow or white flowers. To us, they often look very plain, a simple yellow solid color. But to bees that can see in the ultraviolet end of the spectrum, they have these patterns that again act as little targets for the bee to land on and figure out where their pollen, in this case, is to collect. So the bee will come and land on this rudbeckia and collect all of the pollen it can get. So these are just two forms that have been repeatedly evolved over and over again to attract bees, because the bees tend to like these purples and blues or whites and yellows. All right, what about moths and butterflies? Well, moths are pretty characteristic flower colors because they tend to forage, especially hawk moths, in the evenings. So in the late evenings or early morning when it's fairly dark out, the white flowers of these hawk moth pollinated plants will stand out and attract these insects. They also have long, tubular, very narrow flowers, which often prevent bees from getting down into the nectar. But the proboscis, or the tongue of the moths, can reach all the way down and get nectar that's hidden way down here at the end of this tube. These plants also tend to be very strong smelling and sweet in order to attract pollinators at night. Butterflies that forage during the day or diurnal have similar shaped flowers as hawk moths, right? These long, tubular, skinny flowers, but they're often quite colorful, again, with sometimes these nectar guides guiding them in, where you'll find everything from blues to oranges to purples that are attractive to these butterflies. Red bird pollinated plants. These are some of my favorites. So some birds, most characteristically in the Americas, hummingbirds, will feed on nectar produced by plants. These plants will have lots and lots and lots of nectar to fill up a hummingbird. They often have big tubular flowers that are much fatter than those found on butterfly and hawk moth plants, mostly because the beaks and the tongues of the hummingbirds are bigger than the proboscis of the butterflies. They're also often red. Now, some people think that's because birds like red. The other hypothesis is that Bees don't like red. And we've already said that bees are so incredibly common that they'll go and steal nectar from any plant around, even if they're not very good at spreading its pollen. And so red flowers are hidden to bees because bees, turns out, cannot see red. It looks kind of just like a black green blends in with the background. So one thought is that maybe these hummingbirds actually like red flowers simply because they know the bees are not there. But we do often see bird pollinated species being these reds and oranges that are not very attractive to bees. And I would also note that it's not just hummingbirds that are attracted to these flowers. So hummingbirds are in the Americas, but sunbirds in Africa and Asia and honey eaters in Australia are also birds that are attracted to flowers to drink their nectar. And these flowers show similar characteristics of these tubular shapes with lots of concentrated nectar. Turns out some flowers really want to attract flies. Flies are not going to these flowers to eat nectar. Flies are going to these flowers because they think it's rotting flesh. So look carefully at these flowers and we see that they're these dark reds and purples and blacks with this striated pattern that looks a little bit like rotten flesh. Turns out these flowers also smell like rotting flesh. So if you walk by one, just keep on walking. But the flies love them. They're attracted to them. They get stuck up in them. They cover themselves with pollen by the mistake. By the time they leave, they're so confused, they go to another one and move the pollen along. Beetles. Some people have studied beetles and plant pollination, and it looks like it could be that some of the first close relationships between flowering plants and pollinators is actually with beetles. So these relationships are millions and millions and millions of years old. These beetles sometimes will eat some nectar, but they also want to nibble on the flower parts, the petals, the anthers, the male reproductive parts. So we get two types of flowers that are attractive to beetles. One are these big open flowers that have super tough petals that are not so great for chewing on and a little bit resistant to them. The other are these groups of really teeny little flowers where the reproductive parts are sticking out, and as the beetles crawl across it, maybe nibbling on nectar, maybe chomping on the flowers a bit, they get completely covered in pollen and move it to the next plant that they go to. All right, last one is bats. So we love bats most of the time because they eat mosquitoes. Turns out other bats really like nectar. So some flowers are huge, big enough to fit a bat head into. And again, white, because bats tend to be out at night or in low light, and the white will stand out and attract them. They also smell strong to attract a pollinator at night. All right, so let's switch over and see some of these pollinators types that are in my garden now. So here is an Enethera evening primrose flower that's in my garden. And you can see that it's got this characteristic circular yellow flower shape that is often incredibly attractive to bees. And if I had a UV light that I could shine on it, you would see that there's these pattern of UV right here that centers the bee to eating the pollen.
Excuse me, Robin, can I interrupt for a second? The camera is on you as opposed to the big screen. There we go, perfect.
Does that work?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. Great. All right. So this is one characteristic bee flower. This is the Enethera. Here's a little Salvia that was in my garden. Now I'm not going to be able to show you too close just because of the focus on this camera, but hopefully you can see each of these little purple flowers has a big bottom lip right here that will hold a little bee as it's trying to dive in and get the nectar. This is a tropical salvia. Where we grow, it's just an annual, but where they evolved natively, it would be a bird pollinated plant where the bird's beak would dip in here. Now the flower's out. And hopefully you can see that there's these, what we call exerted reproductive organs. What does that mean? That means when the flower is sticking like this, the anthers, the male parts and the female parts are usually sticking out of the flower. So as the bee, or the bird sticks its beak in, it taps the top of its head with pollen. I also have a couple plants that have probably evolved to be butterfly pollinated. So one of them is this Carnation. Again, this little dianthus has got a super narrow corolla tube right here, and hidden way down at the bottom, there'll be some nectar. Now, some very little bees could sneak in there, but really it's waiting for a butterfly with its long tongue. The same with this verbena. See how long that tube is? All the way down there. And it's all the way down there that there's a little bit of nectar. And only if you're a butterfly with a long tongue can you reach all the way down there. And inside this tube, covered with pollen that the butterfly will collect on its tongue. So there's a couple examples. Let's go back to me. Of what I could find in my garden just this morning running around with my kids. And my guess is that you can also go out to your garden and start looking at these shapes and colors and patterns and placement of the reproductive organs and start to figure out that, oh yeah, this one is probably waiting for a bee to come in and tap its head with pollen as it reaches for its nectar. Or maybe it evolved to attract a hummingbird and come and get it. One other really exciting pattern that we see often in plants is that these transitions back and forth from bee syndrome to hummingbird syndrome, or these suites of traits that are really attractive to hummingbirds. Say here in this salvia, we have, again, red with these fat tubular flowers and the reproductive organs sticking out. And then a really closely related species here, this other salvia, that has these little purple flowers with these big lower lips that bees can rest on, and nectar guides that they can then find the nectar down in there. So we see these two salvias are super closely related, but have very, very different flowers. And we look at this lobelia, and we see that same pattern repeated, where one lobelia has these red tubular fat flowers with the reproductive organs sticking out, whereas this lobelia that's really closely related has these purple flowers with the big bottom lip and the nectar guides. And we see it over and over again in the aquilegia or the columbines, the ipomea, the morning glories, the petunias and the mimuluses, in wildflowers and in all the cultivated flowers that we put in our garden. We see that things that are really distantly related, that is a petunia with a salvia, show very similar flowers, this red tubular and red tubular. And things that are really closely related, these two salvias or these two petunias, show very different forms of color and smell and patterning and shape. And so we see that that evolution has acted fairly quickly and quite frequently to shift and change the way in which these flowers present themselves to the pollinators in order for each one of them to get what they think or have learned to be the best possible pollinator to move the pollen around. So these characteristic patterns of color, shape, smell, nectar amount, position of the reproductive organs, we call Pollinators syndromes. And they're not rules, but they're really interesting patterns that I think you'll be able to see. And by looking at these patterns, we can learn both about what pollinators want and about how plants have figured out a way to get that. So I think we have taken advantage of this beauty of pollinators, of flowers, by creating these incredible gardens that we love to visit or grow or walk through. Whereas the plants are just trying to figure out the best way to convince a pollinator to come, to take its pollen, to move it to another flower, hopefully of the same species, so it can make a seed. So now I want to take one last minute right before we go to questions to look at a few of the cool plants that are blooming in the Arboretum and start piecing apart some of what they are showing us about pollinators and what they want. All right, so this here is a wisteria taken from that plant. Now these are very much like all what are called legumes or pea flowers plants. And they're pretty neat. I'm gonna take one of these off here. And what I want you to see is that when the bee tries to get in here to get the nectar, the reproductive organs pop out like this. So they are hidden under this keel. And as the bee goes in, it pushes it back and it hits them. Usually it's like this, right on the top of the head. So many of these pea plants, sometimes they'll be on little triggers, but they're always hidden right under this keel where they'll tap and hit. Let's do that. There's the reproductive organs. So again, we see this characteristic purple flower color with the big open mouth and this landing pad, but hidden inside in just the right way are the reproductive organs, those anthers to tap the top of a bee. That's a wisteria. They're blooming over in the vine and shrub garden now. All right. How about these honeysuckles? All right, these white, extremely long, narrow tubes are likely evolved to attract some hawk moths or nocturnal moths. We have their reproductive organs sticking out here, so as the butterfly or moth dips in to get the nectar, they're covered with the pollen here. There's a bunch of these honeysuckles blooming in the vine and shrub garden and also around the, over near the lilacs, I believe. All right, and here, oops. Good. Put the names up of who we have here. This guy, little guy, probably looking for diurnal butterflies. Little bees could fit in there, but they're pretty narrow. We've got this bright purple color, and way down at the tip, I wonder if we'll be able to see it. There'll be just a little burst. You probably can't see it. There's a little bubble of nectar. So I often do that just to see how much nectar there is. If you squeeze it like this, you'll see a little bubble of nectar. And if there's just a teeny little bit that's super, super sweet, it's probably waiting for a butterfly to come and take it. These guys are pretty neat. All right. Here's a Viburnum. These smell awesome. They're a little, they're sweet, but almost rotting fruit sweet. These probably evolved primarily for beetles, but they're generalists in that bees and even butterflies will come and visit them. And their trick is that I'm putting it on its side, so hopefully you can see all of these. These are the little anthers sticking up. And as any pollinator tries to walk across it, it will just be covered, its entire underside, by pollen. And they'll be sticky with nectar, which they're trying to get. And as they fight to get the nectar, they'll get themselves completely covered with pollen. And then they go to the next flower, and some of these little strands sticking up are stigmas or pistils with stigmas on the tops that will then rub the pollen right off. All right, one more flower to show you. These are one of my favorites. These are mountain laurels. Just past peak mountain laurels in the Arboretum. These are Kalmias. All right, these are my favorites because they have Catapult Pollen. I had a graduate student who studied these for part of his PhD. And what he discovered, all right, here you go. This is the female part. Can you guys see that a little bit? It sticks straight up at you. It's going to be obvious if you ever go see one. The male parts are tucked into the petals. I'm going to release one here. Did anybody see that? It shot. Do another one. Shot. Maybe you guys can even see the pollen as it lands out. You should definitely try this at home. As the bee walks across this flower trying to get the nectar out, it releases these anthers from their little pockets. There are the little pockets right there. Shooting the pollen. It goes 8 miles per hour, but it has an acceleration of something like 3,000 meters per second squared, which is crazy. That's, you know, sports cars trying to go 0 to 60, this pollen would win for sure. It's one of the fastest accelerating biological organs that's ever been recorded. And what this graduate student discovered is that as the bees land here and start looking for nectar down here, these anthers get popped out, shooting its pollen, and it lands on the back of the bee where the bee can't reach it, and the bee very well, and the bee then brings it to the next flower and rubs up against the stigma, leaving the pollen there. Pretty neat mechanisms. All right, so what have we done? We've talked about some of the diversity. We've talked about some of the function of this diversity of attracting pollinators. We've looked at some of this diversity. We've pulled some flowers apart. And I hope that some of this gives you guys a new way to look at the flowers that are in the garden or walking down the street or walking through the arboretum and thinking about what is it about this flower that's attractive to a particular pollinator, or how does this flower manage to be really good at getting or giving pollen. And so with that, I thank you for joining me, and I would be happy to take a bunch of questions.
Thank you, Robin. That was very, very exciting. And I love the diversity of flower forms that you shared and how many of them are things that I see all the time when I'm in my own garden and never really thought about what's going on there. So we do have a question and it's from Jim Bradeen. We're going to answer it live. It goes, the speaker has indicated multiple times that some flowers produce a lot of nectar and some produce a little bit of nectar. Similarly, some produce concentrated nectar and some produce more dilute nectar. How do plants decide the right amount of concentration? Is there competition between plants for pollinators that drive this process?
Oh, that is such a good question. So nectar is like a couple other traits where, well, nectar is one of those traits where that's the reward, right? So plants need to make enough nectar to convince a pollinator to come and stay. They want to make not too much nectar because they don't actually want to fill the pollinator up. They want that pollinator to get enough to say, oh, I like this. Now I'm going to go to another plant that's just like that and get another treat, right? If they're full, they won't move on to another plant and the plant won't be, that flower won't be able to move its pollen. But if they like it enough, then they'll move to another flower that looks very similar and hopefully is the same species and move that pollen there. So pollinators like butterflies have really small stomachs, but they need a lot of energy. And so they want fairly concentrated little amounts of nectar. And the plant has to use a lot of energy, a lot of carbon to make all that sugar to fill that nectar. So they don't make very much of it, right? They don't want to fill up that butterfly, but they want to give it a really sweet burst. Whereas bees can take a little bit more. They have their own special gut for nectar. So they'll take a little bit more nectar at a time. So plants will make it slightly more dilute and a little bit more of it, so that bees will fill up and take as much as they can, but they'll still want more. So they'll go to another flower. And in this way, plants sort of play a little bit of push-pull, tug of war with the pollinators, where they give them what they want, but not too much of it, so that they just keep going back and forth to that plant.
All right, let's see. Is climate change impacting pollination of flowers?
Yes, there is a lot of research about climate change and pollination. There's some major concerns about what we might call shifting phenology. That is, plants respond to their environment and flower at what they hope is the right time to get good pollination, good water to set seeds and to grow, and early enough so that they can set their seeds before winter comes, but maybe not too late so that they don't get all dried up in the summer heat, right? So all of those signals are shifting with climate change. And so plants are beginning to flower at different times. The same is true for pollinators, where birds that are migrating are coming at slightly different times because the signals of when summer is starting and winter is over are shifted. And when bees are coming out of dormancy and beginning to build their hives, all of those are shifting as well. And so the one fear is that there's going to be a shift in when the plants are ready to be pollinated and when the pollinators are there ready to pollinate them. So some studies have shown that this might be a concern. The other concern is just that some plants are adapted to very particular types of environment with the amount of water and temperature and nutrients, and pollinators are the same way. And if with climate change those shifts mean that the plant can exist where its pollinator can't, then again we will have problems making sure that we have enough pollination for the plants. So yeah, that's a huge area of research and problematic. One of the hopeful studies that has been done, or hopeful thoughts, is that a lot of these pollination systems are very robust, which means there's actually a lot of species of bees and there's a lot of species of butterflies, and they are redundant and they overlap in what they want. And so one hope is that we can, because of this redundancy, some of the bees will be able to still be there and some of the butterflies will be there, and just enough to get these plants through until organisms can adapt and evolve. But it's a huge problem.
So here's a related question. Since a lot of climate changes, pollinators are becoming more extinct, or there's quite a devastation of them, and that's happening very quickly. Is there evidence that flowers are changing up their strategies, and are flowers changing quickly?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that we do not have evidence of flowers being able to evolve fast enough to compensate for the decline in pollinators. So this huge loss of insects due to all anthropogenic change, not just changes in temperature and precipitation, but changes in pollution and in disturbance, there's not evidence that plants are adapting fast enough. The one way that we might be could be seeing some plants evolving some tolerance to that is with the evolution of self-pollination. And this hasn't been documented, but again, it's a hopeful that plants often have genetic mechanisms that prevent them from using their own pollen to make seeds. But that can break down. And if plants can evolve a way to set their own seeds without pollinators, then they can start again limping along until pollinators can catch up. But no, we really just do not have evidence of that on the large scale.
And I think that in a way is the opposite of this question. What is the time scale of this kind of pollinator flower coevolution?
Couple million years. So these plants, the like Salvia and Lobelias and Ipomoeas, they're all, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 million years diverged. So some of the traits can evolve very quickly, right? A flower color can switch with 1 or 2 genetic mutations and spread pretty quickly through a population. Some of these other traits, like the shape of a flower, are going to require a lot of genetic mutations in particular genes, and they're going to take a long time to change to accommodate these pollinators.
Ted Tompkins has a question. He raised his hand, so I'm going to ask him to ask his question.
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk just briefly about why and when we had the divergence of monoecious versus dioecious flowering plants.
Whew, not my area of expertise. Millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. It is one of the early splits of flowering plants. Yeah, that is not my area of expertise. I'm sorry. Beyond knowing millions of years ago.
We'll have to do another talk for some other speakers who have that expertise on them. Totally different question. Do all cactuses have flowers?
Yes. Yes. Cacti are flowering plants. In order to set seed, they need to have a flower. Now, they will not all flower in your house. Some of them are very particular about the conditions under which they will make a flower. But yes, all cacti will have a flower. They need a seed in order to make offspring.
Here's a question from a friend of ours. He's a beekeeper and usually sees all kinds of different colored pollens that the bees bring to the hive.
Yes.
Is there any way to find out what kinds of pollens match up with what kinds of plants?
Oh, yes, there are pollen libraries. So some herbaria can keep track of them. Off the top of my head, I don't know what they are, but yes. So, we often think of the diversity of flowering plants in petals, but pollen and even nectar can vary a ton in color and smell and shape. And there are pollen libraries. Frankly, bees don't go very far. And so a walk through the woods and a deep look at a flower will probably tell you which plant it came from. They're not moving more than a mile around you, mile or two around you. So I think that's probably your best bet for figuring out what plant it is, just going for a walk.
Here's a question about the timing of flowering and if it relates to when insects are feeding. And in particular, this is being thought around milkweed and the monarchs in particular.
Right, so if they're synced up, yes, very much so. So the over evolutionary time, the plant that flowers at the right time, that the pollinator is there to move the pollen between plants and set a seed, are going to reproduce more. And so over evolutionary time, again, hundreds of thousands to a million years, there's been adjustments in how the plant responds to the environment and when it will flower that will help it predict when the pollinator is there. And that's going to be both for when it's flowering to attract pollinators and when it produces strong amounts of defensive compounds to prevent herbivory, right? So in the same way that insects are coming to pollinate it, insects are also coming to eat these plants. And so at different times, they're going to be more susceptible to the herbivores that are coming through or to the pollinators that are coming through. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this is very predictable depending on the seasonality of a particular climate, right? When things warm up, when things cool down, controls migrations, the day length often controls migrations and flowering times. And so, yeah, they're often in sync.
So that makes me realize that it's such a complex issue, right? There isn't just a cause and effect. You do this and you get that. There are so many other factors that play into this relationship between pollinators and plants.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, if the milkweeds aren't blooming, then the pollinators also don't get their food or a place to lay their eggs, right? And so there's also a need for the pollinators to be in sync with the plants. And so that relationship is under very strong selection. And if it gets messed up because, you know, genetic mutations shift when the flowering time is or when migration occurs, then those plants or that pollinator won't be able to reproduce successfully.
Going back in time, evolutionary history, all the way back to probably one of the first flowering plants, the Ambarella. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about what its first pollinators might have been?
No. And we guess that many of those early flowering plants were something like beetle pollinated just because of the insects that were around, but we don't know. So even before flowering plants, cycads or, you know, non-flowering plants, it looks like there's evidence that they were beetle pollinated, and that's probably indicative of maybe somehow some early flowering plants, but we just, yeah, I don't know specifically.
There seems to be a lot of interest in the chemical compositions of nectar. There was another question about it. This one is about the chemical composition. What is the principal sugar in pollen, or perhaps nectar? For example, clearly honeys from different flowers have different tastes.
Yeah.
Is it the sugars or the other chemicals in the pollen?
Usually it's the proteins and the plants that make the different flavors. Plants make all these what are called secondary metabolites. Things like, okay, you know, blueberries are blue and high in antioxidants, right? They're making all of these phenolics, smelly compounds, chemicals that are often used to deter herbivores or attract pollinators, and they get mixed up in the pollen and in the nectar, and that, or the pollen, and that is often what is making things taste differently. Some of that is in the nectar. The sugars are, I want to say it's mostly glucose. There's at least 2 sugars in there, and I think that's like sucrose and glucose. I mean, it's very basic, simple sugars. And that's in all the nectar, but the other compounds, there's a couple proteins and then these secondary metabolite things like antioxidants and flavonols and stuff are going to be the things making them taste different.
Why do some flowers close at nighttime? And is this related at all to pollination?
Ooh, so we don't know why they close, but one thought is that it is, it's protective, right? So if you close up, then those petals are now protecting all the reproductive organs. The anthers, they protect the pollen, the stigmas, so anything crawling around at night or brushing up against it won't be able to disturb the nectar in there, or the pollen and the stigmas. The other thing that we don't know much about, but nectar is actually pretty costly. I mean, it's using a lot of, water and sugars, and it can evaporate a lot. And so you can also, by closing your petals, prevent evaporation or decrease evaporation of nectars and stuff. So it's probably to conserve energy and save and prevent damage, but we don't really know. I don't think there's been a lot of study of it, but yeah.
The question is something like this. Miltonia orchid gives a full portrait of the moth it is trying to attract, but is that portrait in the petals male or female or sexless?
So most orchids are either pollinated by bees or by moths, right? So these orchids with very long nectar spurs are going to be pollinated by moths that have long proboscis that go down into the nectar spur. Those orchids, actually all orchids, are hermaphroditic. So there's both male and female reproductive parts in that orchid. And the goal is that you get the pollinator in just the right position so that the pollen, which is packed into these little packets called pollinia, will land in a particular spot, say, you know, here on that moth or bee, if it is a bee pollinated one. And then when it goes to the next flower, it's perfectly positioned to, again, search for the nectar down at the tip of the nectar spur, and land that pollen right on the stigma to do reproduction. So the shape of the flower is going to help both male and female reproduction, and the shape of the flower is going to help determine whether it's catering to giving nectar to a moth, butterfly, or a bee.
Okay, I think we're down to just one last question. In terms of hybrid varieties of flowers, this speaker attendee has heard that many hybrid varieties are not as attractive to pollinators. And if that is true, why would that be? What is happening with the human interference of hybridization of flower plants?
That's a great question. Okay, so let's think about if we go back to that example of the, say, salvias, right? Where we have that really cool bird pollinated one that's fat and red and big open mouth and with the exerted reproductive organs. And then that little bee pollinated one that's purple with the big bottom lip and the nectar guides, right? We cross them together and you might get a spectacular magenta plant that has, you know, intermediate sized flowers with maybe a big bottom lobe and a big upper lobe. And the bee is going to take one look at that and be like, oh, where do I land? And I can't get in this tube, it's too narrow. And the bird's going to take one look at that and be like, and go for the nectar, but the reproductive organs may be in the wrong spot. Right? So by crossing plants that are adapted to different pollinators, we might get absolutely gorgeous diversity, but they may not work because of the fit of the organs or the placement of the nectar for pollinators to actually pollinate them. Now, that doesn't mean pollinators won't try, but so they might come to your garden, but the plants won't succeed in setting seed that way. And sometimes they won't try, right? If you have something that should be visited by a bee, but you turn it red, well, then the bees aren't going to come. They're not going to see it very well. So I think that's one of the problems with some of these hybrid varieties.
So I suppose that could be a great way for us to end the webinar. Are you pretty much in favor of planting natives and trying to stay true to the native plants around so that we're not messing up all these timings?
I think planting native plants is great. One, because they'll probably do the best in your garden. They're meant to be there. And two, it does attract native pollinators. But I think there's also something to be said for just appreciating beauty and nature's beauty. And if planting an exotic garden that shows you the beauty of biological life inspires you to conserve biological life, then plant whatever you want. You know, I think, yes, it would be great if we were all native, but I think we all garden and are around plants for different reasons. And sometimes it just is good for the soul to be around beautiful things. And so be a little easy on yourself.
Well, thank you so very much, Robin, for spending your afternoon with us and sharing so much of your passion with flowers and pollinators with all of us.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope you all enjoy the plants out there.